And moving on, diplomatic tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia have escalated over a mega dam on the Nile River. Egypt claims that Ethiopia's actions on the Nile have triggered flooding in Sudan. This as it accuses Addis Ababa of opening the gates of the mega dam it inaugurated last month. Ethiopia has dismissed the allegations as false. Cairo accuses Addis Ababa of reckless and irresponsible management of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD.
In September 2025, Ethiopia inaugurated the largest hydroelectric dam in Africa, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. $5 billion, 145 meters tall, capable of generating 5,000 megawatts of power. Egypt called it an existential threat. The Nile provides 97% of Egypt's water. Any disruption could devastate agriculture that feeds 100 million people. This isn't just a water dispute. It's a conflict that could destabilize North Africa's largest economy, and that has direct implications for your portfolio. Let me show you why. Here's the geography. The Nile forms from two rivers, the White Nile from Lake Victoria and the Blue Nile from Ethiopia's Lake Tana. They merge in Khartoum, Sudan, then flow through Egypt to the Mediterranean. The Blue Nile provides about 85% of the Nile's water during flood season. And that's where Ethiopia built its dam, 14 kilometers from the Sudanese border. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam holds 74 billion cubic meters of water. For context, that's 1.5 times the average annual flow of the Blue Nile. When Ethiopia fills that reservoir, less water flows downstream. Think about what that means. Every cubic meter held in Ethiopia is a cubic meter Egypt doesn't receive. During drought years, that arithmetic becomes zero-sum. One country's reservoir is another country's crisis. Ethiopia started construction in 2011, during Egypt's Arab Spring chaos. The timing wasn't coincidental. While Cairo dealt with revolution, Addis Ababa broke ground on the most consequential infrastructure project in modern African history. By September 2024, they completed the fifth and final filling. In September 2025, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed inaugurated full operations. 6 of 13 turbines are running. The rest come online over the next 2 years. The dam is a fait accompli. Egypt's position is straightforward. The Nile is a matter of survival. A 1959 treaty gave Egypt 66% of Nile waters and Sudan 22%. Ethiopia wasn't party to that treaty. It was negotiated by colonial powers who didn't consider upstream nations. Ethiopia argues it shouldn't be bound by agreements it never signed, and they have a point. Why should a country accept permanent limits on its own rivers because of deals made in London and Cairo 60 years ago? 13 years of negotiations produced no binding agreement. The African Union mediated. The US tried in 2020. Ethiopia walked out when they felt the terms favored Egypt. Trump recently offered to restart mediation, and Egypt accepted. But Ethiopia has the dam. Their leverage is now physical, not diplomatic. Why did Ethiopia take this risk? Because electricity is development. Ethiopia has 120 million people, Africa's second largest population. About half lack reliable electricity. Think about that number. 60 million people, more than the population of South Korea, without consistent power. No electricity means no factories, no cold storage for agriculture, no reliable internet for services, no modern economy. The GERD will double Ethiopia's power capacity overnight. At full operation, it generates 5,150 megawatts, enough to power the country and export to neighbors. Ethiopia already sells electricity to Djibouti, Sudan, and Kenya. The GERD turns them into East Africa's dominant power exporter. This is the beginning of regional energy integration. Cheap, reliable electricity supports the manufacturing, technology, and services economy they're building to complement that aviation strategy. The dam cost $5 billion, roughly 7% of Ethiopia's GDP at construction start. No international financing. Egypt lobbied successfully to block World Bank and other institutional funding. They pressured European development banks, They made the case that financing the dam would destabilize the region, so Ethiopia financed it domestically. Government bonds, diaspora contributions, and Chinese contractors willing to work without Western backing. Every Ethiopian was asked to contribute. We'll discuss management, but the dam isn't going anywhere. Egypt's concern isn't irrational. The country receives 18 millimeters of rainfall annually. Ethiopia gets 848. That's not a typo. Egypt gets almost no rain. The entire country, 100 million people, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, depends on water that originates in other countries. Agriculture accounts for 13% of Egypt's GDP and employs millions of farmers in the Nile Delta. The Delta is one of the most productive agricultural regions in Africa. The immediate risk is drought management. During normal years, the GERD may actually benefit Egypt. Egypt faces water shortages that could devastate crops and displace rural populations. Let me translate this into portfolio terms. Egypt already has serious debt problems. Start with the headline number, around 90% debt to GDP. Then consider the servicing burden. Interest payments consume 45% of government revenue. Nearly half of everything Egypt collects goes to debt service, before paying for anything else. External debt stands at $161 billion. And here's the number that matters most for near-term risk: $71 billion in foreign currency debt service due over the next 3 years. That's money Egypt must find in dollars and euros, not Egyptian pounds. The country needs $42 billion in external funding for fiscal year 2025 to 26 alone. Egypt faces agricultural crisis, crop failures, rural displacement, potential social unrest, all while servicing massive debt obligations. This is the scenario that keeps Egyptian finance ministry officials awake at night. Egyptian bonds have rallied recently. International bond yields dropped to around 4% as Gulf support and IMF programs stabilized confidence. But that pricing assumes continued stability. A water crisis would reprice Egyptian debt immediately. The Suez Canal is the other consideration. Egypt earns over $9 billion annually from canal revenues, about 2% of GDP, and a critical source of hard currency. Foreign ships pay in dollars to transit. That revenue doesn't depend on Nile water. The canal isn't directly threatened by the GERD dispute. Egypt's canal revenues dropped as traffic declined. The Suez and the Nile aren't connected hydrologically. The infrastructure positions Ethiopia for manufacturing growth that requires reliable power. But Ethiopia also went through debt restructuring. The Tigray conflict damaged infrastructure and displaced millions. Capital markets access remains limited. Foreign direct investment has been cautious. This is a frontier market opportunity, high reward. But you need frontier market tolerance for volatility and political risk. The GERD is operational. That's a genuine achievement. But Ethiopia's broader economic trajectory still carries significant uncertainty. The realistic assessment: Egypt is too big to fail regionally. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar have pumped over $35 billion in support since 2022. They bought state assets at premium prices. They deposited billions in Egypt's central bank. They won't let Egypt collapse. The regional implications are too severe. But that support is priced in. Current Egyptian bond yields reflect Gulf backing. They reflect IMF programs. They reflect the assumption that external support continues. Any deterioration in the water situation adds risk that current yields don't fully capture. Part 5. What happens next? So where does this leave us? The GERD is operational. Ethiopia has the leverage of physical infrastructure. 74 billion cubic meters of leverage, to be precise. Egypt has legitimate water security concerns, but limited options beyond diplomacy. 13 years of talks produced nothing binding. Trump's mediation offer is the latest attempt, but Ethiopia has little incentive to accept constraints now that the dam is running. What would they gain? They already have the water. For investors, Egyptian assets carry water risk that isn't fully priced. This doesn't mean avoid Egypt. Gulf support and IMF programs provide a floor. but understand that a severe Nile Basin drought would stress the country's finances at exactly the wrong time. Position sizing matters. If you hold Egyptian exposure, stress test your thesis against a 2-year drought scenario. For African development, the GERD represents something important: African infrastructure built by Africans for African development priorities, despite Western and regional opposition. Ethiopia took a sovereign risk and financed it domestically when the world wouldn't help. And it's paying off in electricity generation. This is what infrastructure sovereignty looks like. It's messy. It creates conflict, but it also creates development. The question is whether Egypt and Ethiopia can find a management framework that serves both countries, or whether this becomes a permanent source of regional tension. The Nile has sustained civilizations for 5,000 years. Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia. Civilizations that rose along these waters when Europe was forests. What happens next will determine whether the river continues to sustain them or becomes a source of conflict. Next week, Nigeria's Crisis Explained: how Africa's largest economy went from oil giant to currency collapse, and what happens next. I cover the stories that move markets, from someone who actually lives this. Subscribe if you want African economic intelligence before mainstream media catches up. I'll see you in the next one.